My name is Shay Brown. I am a student at Hastings College, and I'm doing an oral history project on the Vietnam War, and I'm currently here with Leslie Brown, interviewing him about the Vietnam War. We are in Gothenburg, Nebraska, and it is October 16th, 2016, and it's 3:09 p.m. in the afternoon. I want to start off by asking you, when and where were you born?
I was born October 3rd, 1946 in Gothenburg, Nebraska.
Who were your parents?
My parents were Raleigh Brown and Dorothy Brown.
How many siblings did you have?
I have 2 sisters and a brother.
All right. What did your parents do for a living?
My parents farmed south of Cozad.
Okay. And on the farm, did you have any duties? What were your household duties as a child?
Didn't really have any household duties. My job was, growing up, was taking care of the chickens. We had pigs. I'd feed the pigs. When I got a little older, like 9, 10 years old, I started milking cows.
All right. What sort of family traditions, if any, did you have?
I think some of the fonder family traditions was we used to get together as an entire family, all my cousins, aunts and uncles, everything as a kid, and make a family outing hunting. We love sports. In my childhood, we didn't have TV, so that was some of our entertainments. And another family tradition was get together for big family dinners. We like to get together quite often for big family dinners. And I suppose those 2 things was probably stuck out the most as a kid.
Mm-hmm. What town did you say you grew up in again?
I grew up in Gothenburg, mainly.
Mm-hmm.
We did live south of Cozad when I was quite small, and then we moved southwest of Gothenburg. But I went to a rural school by both places where we lived, and it was a small one-room school. Normally 10 to 15 students is all. Most of the time I was the only student in my class, so it was quite small.
So going back to your community and where you grew up in, did you like the community that you lived in? Was there anything you didn't like about it? Things that stood out to you?
I liked the community. I really did. We spent about equal amount of time between Cozad and Gothenburg, and I'd say both communities were real similar in size, real similar in personality of the people you met, and I found them both to be quite friendly communities. And yeah, I really liked them. I can't think of anything that I disliked
about the town. You kind of elaborated on schooling, and you went to a small school.
Yes.
And then elementary, that was kind of your elementary schooling?
Right.
Correct? And then you went on to talk about, like, it was kind of a small school, wasn't very big. What did you enjoy about that school?
Oh, I guess the biggest advantage in a small rural school like I attended, you got personal one-on-one instruction from the teacher, and you got real close to every student in the school, and it didn't matter whether you was in the kindergarten or in the 8th grade. They all played together, they all socialized together, and it was just a unique experience.
Did you have a favorite teacher while you were there?
Stanley Kraske was probably my favorite teacher, and maybe that was because he was the only man teacher I had. All the rest were women teachers, and as a boy, maybe I related to him. And he was a young teacher. He was fresh out of college, and so he was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Any particular subject that you liked compared to others?
Math.
Math.
Always loved math.
Yeah. Friends. Let's talk about your friends. Who were some of your friends, if you remember that far back?
In grade school, Richard Bailey, Kit Coleman, they were probably two of my closer friends in grade school.
Anything you guys did together, hobbies that you had when you would hang out?
We like to go out and pitch a tent and spend the night together out in the tent and pretend like we were cowboys and Indians and we'd attack the whole world.
Okay, let's kind of go into like your teenage years and talk about your family. As you grew up and started to become a teenager, I know sometimes it's different than when you were younger. How did your relationship with your parents change over time, or did it at all, as you were growing into a teen and a young adult?
I would say it probably did not change much, other than my parents, as I grew into early teens, mid-teens, put a lot of personal responsibility on me. They would send me to do jobs that a lot of times you might only expect an adult to go do.
Right.
And I think probably they, instead of treating you like a kid, they treated you more like an adult. That was the difference between as a kid and as a teenager.
Right. So then let's kind of talk about being a teenager and then high school. How was high school for you?
I think the first year in high school, the toughest part was I went from being the only student in the class to we had over 100 students in my class. And I think the cultural shock of trying to socialize with a large group of students and the varied personalities, because some students tended to be self-important and some students were not very friendly and some students were extremely friendly, and I think the first few months, especially the first year, was the hardest. But after I got comfortable with that type of surrounding, it was fun.
Right. Any activities or clubs that you were involved in?
I suppose the most fun was belonging to FFA. I really enjoyed my FFA experience in high school. And I guess the reason for that, as a young kid growing up in a poor family, my family was extremely poor. We never really traveled or went anyplace. And belonging to FFA, we got to go to a lot of the judging meets, state competition. We did a lot of traveling. And that was something that I really, really enjoyed.
So could you kind of explain a little bit what FFA is? I know you kind of talked about meets judging. Is it agriculture related?
Yes, it's basically ag related. I mean, we dealt with crops, science, livestock. We studied soils. We'd go on a judging and we'd study the soils. It was really varied, but it all dealt with strictly ag-related activities. And then it also relied heavily back then on leadership skills. And so we would go into contests where we'd do parliamentary procedure contests in front of groups, teach you to speak, talk in front of a group, and that type of stuff. So it not only dealt with ag-related subjects, but leadership responsibilities too.
Did you have to wear anything particular when you competed in these events?
Your normal FFA, your blue jackets, that was the main requirement. If it was like a state convention or what, you'd wear your blue jacket and a tie, and that was the big deal.
That's a big deal. Any sports that you participated in?
No. Basically, my parents didn't believe in sports. They thought you should go to school, as soon as school was out, come home and go to work.
Right.
And so sports is pretty well off limit. We did do a little track as part of the physical exercise requirements. And so I did run a little track, not competition, but strictly as part of your phys ed type requirements. But as far as sports, no.
Going into high school, what was your favorite subject? Was it still math? Was there any subject that you struggled with?
I suppose math was the one I loved the most. Mm-hmm. If I had a subject, it would probably be certain parts of English. I loved the literature part because I loved reading the literature part, and I loved doing the essays afterwards. I loved getting up in front of class and telling them about what I read and what that was a lot of fun. But when it came to things like diagramming sentences and telling the noun, pronoun, that was one of my least favorite parts.
So more the grammar side of it?
Right.
Yes.
So.
Did you like any teachers at the high school? Did you have a favorite teacher there?
I pretty much got along with and liked all my teachers in high school. My favorite was probably my Folk Ag instructor, which I had all 4 years, and that was Robert Dealey. And I had him all 4 years, and that man was a riot, complete riot. And that was probably my favorite teacher.
Okay, and then as coming into your senior year, did you have any plans after graduating? Were you just going to go and work? Were you going to college?
I spent my whole life wanting to be a farmer. And that's what I wanted all through high school, was to someday be a farmer. I guess that's what, I don't know if this is jumping ahead or not, but because of my military experience, I almost changed job. But up through high school, it was strictly
just work.
Wanted to be a farmer.
Okay. Did your parents like this idea?
No, not really, because their whole life they had struggled and had a lot of trouble financially. And they thought their kids, as I'm sure a lot of parents always do, were smarter and get a better education and do things better and go places. And they considered agriculture as a place where a lot of hard hours and not much financial reward. And so, no, they would have rather all their kids had jobs that would have paid better. And so, yeah, I'm sure they kind of was hoping that I would have went on to school and got something other than being a farmer, but that wasn't where my heart was.
Yeah. We kind of talked about like your duties on the farm or growing up. So that was basically like your first job, you would say? Would you consider that like a first job?
Probably my first job, yes, was working for my dad on the farm. My actual first paying job as a teenager was I got a part-time job working at the local hay mill, and my job for them was every spring they'd hire me to put in hay for them, and so I'd run a tractor for them seeding hay every spring, and that was my first cash-paying job. Was working for the M&R Hay Milling in Gothenburg.
Did it pay pretty well?
It paid exceptionally well, if you can believe this or not. They paid me a whole $1 an hour.
Wow.
And they paid me so much that my dad wouldn't complain because he thought they shouldn't pay a kid that much money, because he said only adults should get $1 an hour. A kid should only be worth 75 cents an hour. And the manager of the hay mill said he's doing a man's job and that's what I'd have to pay any other man, so I'm going to pay him the same as any other man. So I got a whole $1 an hour, which back then was considered quite good.
Did you enjoy that then? The paying side of it, did you like that, or did you just like the job overall?
I just liked the job overall because I always liked being outside. I just loved the outdoors, and that was an outdoor job.
How long did you work there?
I worked there 3 years, 3 springs, seeding hay for them. And then, of course, after I graduated, well, then I went to the military service, and then I never went back to work for
so
them
that
again.
was your main job until you then went into the military.
Right.
Correct. So then this job, you said you got paid $1 and your dad didn't like the fact of that. So then did you have to contribute to your family and use some of the money you earned to go towards like family
No,
financials or?
no, because the job was only 5 days a week, and so I still worked. In fact, I still had to get up before I went to work and milk the cows, and after I got off of work, I still had to come home and milk the cows. I still had
Right.
chores, family chores to do all the
Between
time. So I guess you could say I was still contributing to the family income, and that allowed my dad to work off the farm and do custom work for neighbors and stuff, because I was always around to take care of the chores.
Of the chores. So let's kind of talk about like growing into a young adult in your social life. So the friends that you had in, well, probably high school, were those the same friends carried on into adult life, or when you graduated, did you just kind of disperse from them?
No, I kept in real close touch with all my high school friends. In fact, we still socialize and are still quite close today after all these years. So yeah, it's been a lifelong friendship that I made in high school. They really have been.
So then, could you kind of elaborate on some of the activities you guys did together, if there was any that stuck out to you, or?
Well, we like to do go take in the movies together. They had a miniature golf course. We like to go play miniature golf. We like to go to basketball games, football games, and what together. We like to just sometimes just get in the car and just drive around and talk.
Just go. So you then did not look into going to college at all?
No, my voc ag instructor really wanted me to, and he thought that it was something that would have been important for me. And I guess the reason he felt that way, because he was concerned that coming from a poor family, I'd never be able to financially make it as a farmer. And he wanted me to have a college degree that I could fall back on. And so he really pushed. But I didn't go on for two reasons. Number one, I really wasn't, as a kid, I really wasn't that interested in it. And number two, I really didn't know how I was going to pay for it. There was not the financial aid back then that there is today. And so I didn't want to accumulate a whole bunch of debt. I guess I always wanted to pay things as I went. So
did you have a career in mind, or just strictly just farming, like you said earlier?
yeah. No, I didn't have any particular career. I guess if I wanted to specialize in any particular thing of the ag part, I probably love livestock the most. If I could specialize in one thing, I would have specialized in just taking care of livestock my whole life. I found livestock nutrition and livestock feeding and all that extremely fascinating. If I would have went to college, I probably would have liked to have specialized in livestock nutrition and care of livestock.
And that sort of thing. We talked a little bit about, just briefly, friends. And you kind of went into like what you did and if you hang around them. Did you meet any women, I guess I should say, or throughout this time or sometime in high school? Did you go through any relationships?
Yes, one.
You went through one.
Yeah, I met your grandmother in high school, and she was the first girl I dated, and we stayed close all through high school, and that's who I wound up getting married to. So that was...
Wow. So how long did you guys date before you actually got married?
5 years.
So you dated for 5 years, and then you ended up getting married on what day?
August 28th, 1966.
Okay. So I kind of want to talk about so you dated, let me just back this up. You dated her while you were in high school.
All 4 years.
And then you got married, but I don't want to get to this too far, because then you participated in the Vietnam War.
Right.
So I want to kind of go into that and ask you about drafting. So real quickly, you were still dating her, and then you were drafted into the war, correct?
Well,
Or did you get married
I-
before?
I was going to be drafted, and I had cash rented some ground, and I didn't know what I was going to do when I got my notice. And so I went to talk to the draft office and said, I'm in a bind. I've got this ground that I've cash rented, and what can I do? And they said, well, if you enlist, but it's going to require you to serve 3 years instead of 2. But if you enlist, we can give you a 4-month deferment, which might take you through most of the summer, or at least part of the summer, and that way you get most of your farming done. And he said, to make it last as long as possible, he said, I'll wait until your draft notice comes across my desk. And then he said, I can call you, and you have to get up here that same day and sign up. And then 4 months from that date, then you'd actually have to go in.
Oh, wow.
So I actually wound up enlisting in order to get a 4-month deferment so I could go ahead and take care of my ground. And then that fall, I hired somebody to harvest it for me.
Oh, wow.
So I wound up serving an extra year just in order to take care of my farm ground. And then my wife and I got married after I went in the service, but before I went to Vietnam.
Oh, okay. How did you learn, or did you know anything about Vietnam, about the war, before you actually kind of were drafted and then eventually, you said you had to enlist. Did you know much about the war or what was going on?
Yes, in our high school years, because of people being drafted that we went through high school with that was only a year or two older than us, and naturally they would talk about it, and then we would start saying, well, if this war continues, are we going to be involved? Some of my classmates went ahead and signed up in the National Guard, hoping that their service in the National Guard would keep them out of actually serving in Vietnam, which every one of my classmates that did sign up in the National Guard was kept out of the Vietnam conflict. By the time the end of the senior year came along, the National Guard enrollment had become full, and they wouldn't accept no more National Guard. And so you either enlisted or got drafted because they wasn't taking any more in the Guard. But some of my classmates that signed up at the beginning of the senior year was able to get in the Guards.
Okay. Did that change your perspective then when you got enlisted? Just kind of knowing a little bit before you actually went in?
I don't know if it changed my perspective. I knew enough that I knew I didn't like it. But I don't think my perspective really changed until I was actually over there. I mean, they can tell you about it, but until you actually arrive in country, I mean,
You don't really know exactly.
you really don't know.
Could you then tell me when you actually arrived and what time you were called into duty when you were enlisted?
Well, I actually went to the service in June. Time I finished basic advanced infantry training, I actually didn't arrive in country Vietnam until November of '66.
Was it hard for you to leave your family back behind and your farm and then Diane?
Well, I don't think leaving the farm and the family was as tough as leaving my wife behind was probably the toughest, because by the time it came around, there were stories coming back where there was a fairly significant percentage of the guys was being killed over there and they weren't coming back. And I guess I was concerned that, okay, if I didn't come back, what's she going to do? How's she going to take care of herself? And I think that was my biggest concern.
Right. Did you have any other concerns or fears going into it? Did you think about, you said there's a lot of people, dying over there. Was that like on your mind constantly, or did you just say, I'm just going to do what I'm going to do and not let that bother you?
Well, no, it's a concern, but when you get over there and get involved in doing your job, you pretty much put it out of your mind. It's not something you concentrate a lot. Like in our situation, we worked by what they called Cameron Bay later on. But like in my case, when I first arrived, we was stationed at a base that there was a lot of helicopters coming in with the dead and wounded. And you'd sit there and listening to the screams and the crying and what from the wounded, and they was trying to take care of them. And that was probably, brought home the fact that, what death is really like. And but later on, when we was sent over to Cameron, it really wasn't a daily concern, other than when they would bring gunships over and be shooting over your head at targets nearby, or maybe when they would drop explosives in the bay, because they's always concerned about somebody blowing up a ship. And so on occasion they'd drop concussion explosives in the bay to in case there's anybody trying to float explosives next to the ship. And because they had problems with, occasionally they would try to take floating debris and would swim underneath of it and to try to hide their presence. So whenever they'd see floating debris coming too close to a ship, they would drop explosives over to, in case there was terrorists, or we didn't call them terrorists back then, in case there was North Vietnamese
In there.
in there.
How long were you there?
I was there a year.
You were there a year? Okay, how did you feel? I guess you kind of talked about, I asked you about main concerns, but once you got there, I'm sure it was like eye-opening. Like you said before, you don't really know what to expect. They can tell you until you actually get there.
I think until you actually experience the fear of watching people die and hurt, or the actual filth. I'd always worked on a farm, and which was not a clean working job by any means, but I'd never really experienced the utter filth. There was times we were not able to bathe for maybe 2 or 3 weeks at a time. We had no water. We barely had enough water to drink. And you'd get sores under your arms and between your legs and everything else. The clothes would feel like they were starting to rot off of you because you sweat all the time. And the salt in your system would get to rubbing. And people started smelling almost like they were dead because they'd been so long since they'd bathed. And I guess the utter filth, and the horrible living conditions. We lived on cots, and the dirt and the sand blew over you all the time, and I think those two things was probably something that, as soon as you got back to the States, you really, really appreciated. A clean shower, good foods. Well, for instance, the food.
Yeah, I was asking about
We didn't have no. Growing up on a farm, we always had milk cows, so always had fresh milk. Over there, we had powdered milk that they'd reconstitute water out of the river and put iodine in it to try to kill the bacteria. And so you had water with iodine in it to reconstitute milk. They couldn't keep flour because of the high humidity and what. And so the flour always had bugs in it. And so when you'd eat, say, a biscuit, you could open up the biscuit and it would have dead bugs in it that was cooked inside. And so the food was less than ideal. So you ate real poor quality food, you lived in dirt, and you worked long hours. Sometimes we had to work 18 hours straight. So it was people can tell you about it until you actually lived it. I mean, it's
Difficult. You kind of just then elaborated on the atmosphere and all around you, what was going on and stuff. How do you think at home your wife was feeling, or family? Did you keep in contact with them while you were there?
well, we could write, but usually it'd take a minimum of a week for a letter to arrive. And so current communication was out the window. I mean, usually if you heard from somebody, it was old news.
Right.
But yeah, you was concerned. Our daughter was born while I was over there, and I didn't get to see her. And so you was concerned about your wife. You was concerned about how she was getting along, taking care of herself, and sometimes you'd get to feeling sorry for yourself and your conditions over there, and then you get to thinking, well, there's other people suffering too, and so
Right.
yeah, your family concerns was
major
a major thing too.
Any specific experience you had during the war, or like a vivid memory that stuck out to you while you were there? Anything that went on?
Oh, there was good and bad. The bad was I saw some guys get killed, and that's always an unpleasant experience. And the good is was the friendships you made over there, and I don't know, just something about people in the military or people in combat zone. They get quite close, and that's the plus and minuses.
The plus and minuses. So, were you actually armed at all during that time? Did you have to, like, if someone came up to you, would you and did you have to kill them? The kind of tactics?
No, we weren't armed all the time. While on the ship, we didn't carry no arms, so we worked without arms. While in the company area, sometimes you would pull guard duty and patrol the company area, and then you was armed. But as far as actually being armed while working, and I never had to shoot nobody. Often wondered how I'd react if I had to, but
Right.
I never did.
The uniforms you wear, did you have to carry specific things? Could you kind of elaborate on what you wore and what you kind of had to carry with you? You said you never really had a gun there, but anything else that you had to carry along with you that kind of stuck out, or?
We carried sometimes if we were going to be out on a ship for say like 18 hours and we couldn't get back to mess hall, they would before they brought us out to the ship, you would have these packages of what they called sea rations, and we had to carry them. And you always carried with you like a first aid kit, where you'd carry a bandage and a shot where you could, if you got injured or if a fellow soldier got injured, you could give them a shot of morphine and put a bandage on them. But it was a real simple kit that we'd carry around with us, but that was the extent of anything we carried with us.
Right. Did you actually see any Vietnamese? And, like, if you did see them, did you recognize them? Or were they just like every other soldier? And were you able to point out the enemy, I guess, per se?
No, it would kind of like being I would best describe it, it's like walking down the street in Lincoln, Nebraska, for instance. All the people looked alike. I mean, they're Vietnamese as Vietnamese. They all looked alike. And most of the time, the unfriendly Vietnamese would wear uniforms, but a lot of times they would try to blend in and look like everybody else so they could sneak up. I never had the personal experience, but I had people tell me about they had witnessed a young boy, they estimated to be maybe only 6, 7 years old, walk up and explode a grenade next to some GIs. Of course, he killed himself, but
Right.
those people really had no respect for kids, nothing. I mean, it was a bad situation. But no, I saw at a distance what appeared to be what we called North Vietnamese. I guess the favorite term for military people there, we called them gooks. I don't know how they ever got the name gooks, but anyhow, that's what most of the military people there referred to the North Vietnamese as gooks.
That's good.
And but it wasn't a clear cut who was the good guy and who was the bad guy.
Right.
You never really knew. You'd see Vietnamese and you wasn't sure which was good and which was bad.
So it's kind of hard to find the enemy per se. So then you said you were there for how long again? And then
12 months.
12 months. So okay, and then were you able to return home and when?
Okay, I came back in November of '67, and we really didn't know because we were not privy to any communication.
Right.
And unless you had a family member told you what was going on back in the States, we really didn't know what was going on. But things in the States that year seemed to me like had changed a lot. And so I was somewhat shocked when I returned home, and they ushered us into a Quonset and told us to remove anything to do with the military, put civilian clothes on, and don't even mention that you're in the military.
Right.
And that's the first time it really hit home for me that the public sentiment had turned so sour against the people serving in Vietnam.
Right. So then, yeah, I was going to ask you about the treatment. So as you came back and you said that they told you to strip down and kind of act like you never were over there, didn't contribute, did you think that was right? How did this make you feel?
Well, we felt like we were doing what our government had told us to do. I never knew of a guy over there that volunteered to go over there. I mean, there was nobody, I don't know of anybody in their right mind that would want to go to a place like that. But we felt pride in the fact we had done our job, did our job to the best of our ability, and now we come home and the people are spitting on you. And it really made you feel low. It really did. It really had a real negative effect on you. And it's just, we felt like, well, why is this our fault? We're doing our job. We're doing the job the best we can. We gave a year of our life, and why should we be spit on? And I guess that was my reaction.
So then after you felt this way, would you ever consider going back if they needed you at all?
No.
No. Do you think overall, after you came back and the treatment that you realized you were getting from being in the war, did you think that the war was a good thing or a bad thing after you came back? Did you think there was any point of you going over there if you felt like people back at home didn't support you and respect you at all?
Well, I guess I wouldn't go back for several reasons, but one of them, while over there, I had to work with Vietnamese. And the Vietnamese that I had to work with acted like we as a government owed them something. And I thought, now wait a minute, we're over here working and dying, and we owe you something? You know, I mean, that was the feeling I got. And so you don't tend to want to go back and help a people that's not grateful. So that's probably, you know, a negative opinion, I guess. And then after I got back and saw the public sentiment, I became real bitter at certain classes of U.S. citizens that were bad-mouthing the military and bad-mouthing the military people that served over there, because I felt like they were elitists, or because it seemed to us, from the outside anyhow, that it was mainly college students and that type of people that really had no idea what we were doing or what we had done. And yet, even though they didn't approve what was going on, I mean, I didn't approve what we was doing over there.
Right.
I didn't think we should have been over there. But once over there, I honestly felt like we should have never ever been involved, or we should have went over there with the intention of winning, one or the other. And I still feel that today with everything we do, that we should not get involved unless we plan on winning. If we don't plan on winning, we should never get involved in any conflict of any kind.
I kind of want to ask you about the Vietnamese. You said that they kind of had this more stuck-up vibe, I guess, going towards you as a soldier being there. Do you think that they wanted you there at all? You said that they probably didn't.
No, they just wanted a handout. But see, we weren't the first force to ever. The French had been there for years. And so most of the people my age had never known anything except occupation of foreign soldiers. And so they really didn't know how to act, really, I suppose, because they'd spent years with French involvement. And then they were spending years with U.S. involvement. And I think the people really didn't want nobody there.
Right.
And the ones that were there, they say, well, being you're here, what can you do for us?
Right.
They almost felt like they owed something for you being there. And they didn't get, for some reason, they didn't get the fact that she was trying to keep communists out. And so I don't know, yeah.
If you could explain the war in one word, what would it be?
Well, I guess I'd have to say two words: extremely mismanaged. Really was.
Do you think because of the government? Do you blame the government for this, or do you say it's as the people?
Well, I think the military would have done a lot better job if the military would have been left alone to do it right. But it seems like we can't be involved in a conflict like that without private citizens, and they put restrictions on what they can do and what they can't do. Like, you can only bomb certain locations, or you can't shoot where there might be civilians around. And I mean, from a military perspective, civilian involvement really puts a crimp on things. But I can see the logic from it too, because maybe sometimes military leaders would get involved in things that they shouldn't be either. So it's a balancing act. But Vietnam, the biggest reason Vietnam failed was because of political pressure.
Real quickly, so then who do you think, well, I guess there wasn't really the measurement of success, people say, was the body count. That's how they really knew, if you were winning or not while you were over there. So do you feel like, I guess coming back, it was kind of a waste of time, and do you feel like it was right for the measuring of success to be the body count, and do you think that as many people died as they did, like you said, was it even worth fighting over there? Do you have, I guess,
absolutely not. We shouldn't have been there. Right. Because we didn't go over there with the intention of winning anything. We went over there with the intention of just occupying and trying to maintain. And we should have went over there with the intention of marching across that country and marching into North Vietnam and taking over the government of North Vietnam. And that would have put a stop to it. We probably would have lost 1/10 of the soldiers we lost.
Right.
But instead, they played a waiting game month after month of just holding in place and not really going after the enemy. Just if the enemy attacked you, then you could fight back, and that was it. It was a very poorly planned, very poorly executed conflict. And there should never have been that many young men killed over there. Shouldn't have never been. And we had the opportunities. We could have went into North Vietnam and put a stop to it. But because of the political pressure in the United States, they wouldn't let them invade North Vietnam. And we couldn't even establish a line and say, no, nobody can cross this line. I mean, we had people scattered out all through South Vietnam in pockets. And we would sit there with our bases and wait and just defend those bases. And then when the RVNs or North Vietnamese regulars would bring troops down, surround the base, attack the base. We had a young man from Gothenburg killed that just was standing by his guns, and he was running an artillery outpost, and they just come in and they shot grenade launchers in, and he happened to be the unfortunate one, happened to be standing there. But most of our deaths were caused from just holding a position. We were not allowed to actually, like they were in World War I or World War II, we were even worse example than Korea. Korea, they just stayed in one place and occupied South Korea until somebody decided to have an armistice. And we still today fighting that failed policy of Korea, where you have a North Korea and a South Korea. That should have never been. But Vietnam is basically a repeat of Korea, and they didn't learn anything in Korea, and they didn't learn anything in Vietnam. And that's just my opinion from what I saw going on over there.
Do you feel like that's part of the reason why when you came back, a lot of the people here didn't like that, because they thought one could have been like a repeat of Korea, like you said, or basically just holding positions. And so back at home, you said people don't realize what's going on when you're actually there. And so kind of the misinterpretation of the war and what the government's telling the people here compared to you there, do you think that had a big impact on why certain people spit on you and disrespected the soldiers the way they did?
I think the biggest reason we got the disrespect we did because the national news media decided that we shouldn't be over there. And so they would take people like Jane Fonda, who was very anti-Vietnam, and they'd put her in the public spotlight, and she'd get there and make speeches about how the U.S. soldiers were bombing civilians and how the U.S. soldiers were killing innocent civilians, and the people here in the United States believed it all. And that helped make it a very unpopular war because by the time I come back, they had the opinion that there wasn't a GI over there that wasn't cruel and mean.
Right.
And I think the national news media was probably the biggest reason. And then they also couldn't see why we would want to be in a country just to stop the spread of communism. A lot of them didn't understand
That reasoning.
the reasoning of communism and how bad it was. And maybe our political leaders were more paranoid about communism than what they should have been. I don't know. But
so how has being involved in the war impacted your life personally?
not a lot. Early on after coming back, I thought I was pretty well put it all behind me. But you might be out working and all of a sudden a helicopter come flying over, and just for a moment you get a flashback like you was there again. Mm-hmm. But other than that, no, it really, I don't think, has had much of an effect on my personal life since coming back.
What do you think we as a country or as a nation could have done differently? And then also, do you as a person think you could have done something differently while you were there? Even though you were specifically told what to do, but could you have done something differently if you had the chance?
No, there's nothing I could have done personally, and there's nothing that I don't think a majority of the GIs over there could have done differently. Mm-hmm. There was probably a few bad GIs that left a black eye for the rest of us over there. But you got to remember, GIs are nothing but a representation of the public, and there's always going to be some bad apples, regardless of what you
Right.
got. And so, I think that part was bad. What could have the government done different? I guess, like, I could sort of go back to what I said before. They shouldn't have been there unless they was going to go there to win. And we spent a fortune in resources shipping over things like trains. Now, trains. I mean, things to try and build transportation and what in their country, that had absolutely nothing to do with what we should have been involved in. You know, we should have been strictly military vehicles, planes. We should have been over there to eliminate the threat, go over there and eliminate the threat. We shouldn't have been there as strictly a holding action. We shipped over millions of tons of concrete to build roads and bridges, and that, as from my perspective, really didn't have a lot to do with going over there to
Right.
eliminate an enemy. And so I still say that our government just made some awful poor decisions.
What lessons did you learn that you would want others to learn or remember about this time in history?
Well, I just don't think whether you should get involved in conflicts of that nature. It's kind of reminds me of our involvement in Kuwait, Grenada. I mean, all the other conflicts we've got involved in. It just we should stay completely out, in my opinion, and use tactical weapons that, if they put a present danger on our troops or our society, use tactical weapons, keep the troops out, and if the troops have to go in, don't go in and just leave them sit there and hold a position. They should be sent in to move forward and take out an enemy. And I mean, it's just, I get so aggravated whenever I see something where they go clean out a city and then pull out and let the others move back in and take the city back over. I mean, it just, I don't understand the thinking, but that's the reason I'm farming instead of being in the military.
So then, yeah, I kind of wanted to go into that. You kind of elaborated on like your views and stuff and lessons you learned. So coming back, you returned then home to your family. Can you kind of describe that and how that was for you and how your life evolved since you came back from the war?
When I came back from the war, I still had over a year and a half left in the military. So I was sent, when I came back, to a base in Georgia. And since I didn't have a need for my expertise, obviously, I wound up being sent to what was considered a legal branch of the military, and where they process out all the military's undesirables.
Right.
And I originally got there as a company clerk, which I would just type up paperwork.
Oh, wow.
And after being there a few months, I was promoted to the head specialist. I became a Spec 5, which is a specialist E5, because I specialized in the field. And I worked strictly with a group of lawyers, military lawyers, and I was kind of the liaison between the lawyers and the clerks in our company. And so if anybody in the company had a question on how to legally fill out a form, it was my responsibility to tell them how to fill it out. And then every legal document that left our company, we also had a group of civilian employees that typed up paperwork for us too. and I had to read every legal document that left the company and approve it.
Oh.
And that was my final job there. And so that was my experience after leaving Vietnam. I wound up, and because of my last job, I'd mentioned earlier in the interview that I'd thought about having a career change. I found it quite interesting working with the lawyers and doing that type of work.
That'd be cool.
And a couple of the lawyers tried to talk me into staying in and then taking advantage of the GI Bill and going on to school and getting a legal degree, my law degree. And I really seriously considered it. I really did. But when I was trying to decide what to do, it was spring, and was sitting there with the office window open and listening to the birds chirp. And I just had that itch to be outside. And I guess that's, if it wouldn't have been for that, I probably would have stayed in the Army and got a law degree and continued working in that type of field. But just that one particular day, sitting there listening to them birds and smelling that dirt, I just had to get back and try farming again.
So that little thing kind of
it was
your
a
mind.
changing moment.
Yes.
There.
So then after that, when you made your decision, so then you then returned home after this, and
Yes.
what time about was that? Was that?
That was in February. I wasn't due to get out till June, but since I had studied the law and knew a lot about the law, I knew there was a law in the books that if you was rotating out of the service and you was employed in a seasonal occupation, which farming is seasonal, then I put in an application for an early 4-month early release because I needed to be home in time to start field work to plant crops. And so I actually got released out of the military 4 months early in order to get my seasonal job started on time.
Wow. So then that's when you returned back to the farm,
Right.
and then you began farming again.
Right, that was in '69.
In 69. And so when you returned home, I guess I just want to ask you, like, how was it? Like, your family, how did they react to? Of course, they probably missed you. You said you had a daughter and you missed out on that. Did you have any other kids when you came back, or how had that
No,
changed as you-
when we, of course, my wife and daughter lived with me the year and a half I was down in Georgia. But when I got out and started farming, we didn't decide to have another one until 70. Yeah, and that's when we decided to have another kid, was in 70.
And then you were in, did you stay in Gothenburg? Is this where?
Yeah, I
they
stayed in
were?
Gothenburg.
Okay.
I came back and I asked my dad if he needed some extra help. And he said, yeah, I sure could use some extra help, but I really can't really pay a salary. And I said, well, I'm going to go to the bank and see if they'll loan me money and buy an interest in the operation. And I went and talked to the banker, and he said, yeah. He said, I'll do that. He said, I really shouldn't because you don't have enough equity to really. But he said, I watched you grow up, and he said, you always was working and always tending to business. And he said, it always impressed me. So he said, I'm going to loan you money just based on your work ethic. So, but back then they could do that.
Yeah.
The bank examiners and what weren't riding our local banks as bad as they do today. You could never do that today. But they loaned me money based just strictly on my reputation as
Your
a hard
reputation.
working. And so I bought a percentage of my dad's operation when I got back. And so we went into a limited partnership for 3 years. And then at the end of that 3 years, then we split it up, and that's when I started on my own full time.
All right, and so that's kind of how your life was evolved since then, since the war. So then you ended up having a second kid, and then further yet, I guess I want to ask you, so then you remained farming the rest of this whole time. Did you have any other kids after that? And then later on, I guess, did those kids have kids? Do you have any grandchildren?
Yeah, we wound up having another son in 72. And then we wound up having 8 grandkids. And now we have 2 great-grandkids.
Oh, wow.
And they all live within 3 miles of where we live now.
That's really nice.
And I guess the advantage, they get to come over and enjoy Grandma's cooking.
That's good.
The disadvantage, sometimes they're underfoot.
Okay.
And so you never really have any peace and quiet. There's hardly a day goes by you don't have a member of the family here.
Here, yeah.
And so it's been a great life. It really has. And that's probably why at 70 years old I'm still farming.
Right. Yeah, I was gonna ask you. How has your farming been since then? And do you think that looking back now, anything like sticks out to you? I guess about your life, whether it's specifically about the war, where you are now.
Well, not too much. All the years since I left Vietnam, I just kind of tried to forget it and put it out of my mind. And recently, the Dawson County area decided to establish a fund to try to send veterans to Washington, D.C. to view our monuments. And I guess my whole life I've really wanted to forget I was in Vietnam. I really didn't want no part of it. In fact, you rarely ever even talked about it with anybody. And but with some prodding from my wife, I decided to go ahead and take advantage of that trip. And I guess that trip to Washington, D.C. really changed my opinion of people. Because all these years I've had a real negative opinion of society. And we were really treated great on that trip to Washington, D.C. There was people that saw us with our hats on that came up and thanked us for our service. And here I spent 50 years almost, 49, feeling like, nobody really cared. And now all of a sudden all these people are coming out and shaking your hand and saying thanks for your service. And I think that experience probably changed my view of American society more than anything. Because unfortunately I had kind of a negative view on the general population as a rule. And this country really has a lot of good people in it that I really didn't realize were there until that trip to Washington, D.C.
So that really kind of turned you around?
It really made a difference.
I kind of want to ask you, what day or how long was the trip, first of all? And could you kind of explain more so about the trip, how many went?
Oh, there was, 50 some vets went. Plus, another person went along with them. Some of them to help them because of their physical impairments. Some of them, like in my case, just their spouse went along.
All right, so someone else went with you then.
So that was just double that. I guess if you figure where we started, we were in Washington basically 2 full days. The first day was a bus trip to Omaha, and then the next day we flew into Washington. We stayed there 2 full days. The third day we took a quick tour, and what was it? Early afternoon before we went back to the airport and came back. And so it was a little over 2 days in Washington.
Wow.
It was a And you'd thought in that length of time you'd seen everything, but there were still a lot of things I would have liked to have
Right.
seen. And the monuments, the military monuments, Vietnam Memorial Wall, the Korean Monument, I mean, it was all just, it was super. It really was.
A good experience.
Quite an experience.
All right, well, that seems like that was a good thing to go on. Anything else, I guess, that you want to talk about, go into?
No,
Share.
not really. No.
No, that's just
No.
about it.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you for letting me interview you. This now concludes our interview. It is currently 4:14 p.m. in the afternoon. My name is Shay Brown. I'm currently a student at Hastings College, and I'm doing a project on oral history and the Vietnam War, and I'm currently here with Leslie Brown, who is in the Vietnam War, and we are in Gothenburg, Nebraska, and it is October 16th of 2016, and it is currently 3:07 p.m. in the afternoon. I just kind of want to start off asking you, where and when were you born?
I was born in Gothenburg, Nebraska, October 3rd, 1946.
All right, and who were your parents? Who were you born to?
My parents are Raleigh Brown and Dorothy Brown.
Okay, how many siblings did you have?
I have 2 sisters and 1 brother.
What did you do, like, I guess where you grew up, what were your kind of responsibilities, your household chores, or